Western Christianity has spent the last 2,000 years telling everyone they're separated from God.
This is Not Church with John and Nat Turney.
Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. My name is Nat Turney. I am one of two hosts. One of two. You get two hosts for the price of one. I don't know if you realize what a bargain you're getting. We should probably charge double for this, John. What's 2 times 0? It's still 0 anyway.
I was never good at math.
I'm not an academic, but I know that much.
I've already been relegated to one of the two hosts as opposed to your co-host.
Well, I figured calling you my co-host was a little, perhaps a little demeaning. So it's kind of like, remember that story about Charlie Watts? Somebody said when Mick Jagger said, "That's my drummer," he said, "I'm not your drummer, you're my singer."
Oh, there you go.
Which I just think is incredible. So I'm not your co-host, you're my co-host. So anyway, we are rambling before we've introduced our guest, but this is the podcast that we have lovingly called This Is Not Church, because we like to have unchurchy conversations about church with people that we find interesting and amazing and who are bringing some new stuff and whose voices we really think need to be amplified and heard. So we do what little bit we can to give them even more of a platform. With us today, we are super, super honored and happy and excited, joyful. What other adjectives are going to come up with? Thrilled to have with us Beth Allison Barr. I'm going to read you quickly her bio, and then we're going to jump right into all kinds of amazing stuff. But Beth is a Ph.D. She has a Ph.D. from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She's the Associate Professor of History and Associate Dean of the Graduate School at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. Woo, woo, Texas, where she specializes in medieval history, women's history, and church history. She is the president of the Conference on Faith and History and is a member of the Christians for Biblical Equality. Barr has written for Christianity Today, the Washington Post, Religion News Service, and is a regular contributor to the Anxious Bench, the popular Pathos website on Christian history. She's also been featured in a really cool article that I just read in the New Yorker. She has written this amazing book called The Making of Biblical Womanhood. And that's really what we're here to talk about, this book that's getting a lot of attention, getting a lot of traction, probably coming with its fair share of detractors as well, which I always find a little interesting. But we'll dive into all of that. Welcome to the podcast, Beth. Or should I say Dr. Barr?
Thank you. It's fun to be here. No, Beth is great.
Okay, well, welcome. We're really, really glad you're here. John has devoured your book. I'm about halfway through it. I had to opt for the audio version because my week has got away from me. But man, so far.
I like audiobooks. I listen to them.
I do too. And
yeah.
But I had to stop my car 2 or 3 times to take notes because stuff you said was just, man, there were things you said that were just truth bombs. And I'm like, I need to write that down. I need to ask her about that. So we're just excited. If you wouldn't mind, if you just open up with giving us a little bit of your background, maybe your faith history or, whatever. Just tell us a little bit about you before we jump into the meat of this awesome book.
Yeah. So I'm pretty much a native Texan. My dad was in the Army, so we moved around a little bit. He was an Army doctor. So we moved around a little bit when I was a child, but my parents are both Texans, and I mostly grew up in Texas. I'm also a child of, my parents were of deep faith. And so I don't really remember a time not knowing about Jesus, not knowing the Bible, these were, they didn't cram it down our throats. It was just in the water, how I grew up. And so and because we lived in a small Texas town, there weren't very many churches options. But my mom was Baptist. And my dad had sort of grown up between Baptist and Methodist. He was an even smaller Texas town growing up. So we went to the local Baptist church, and that's the way I grew up. I grew up Baptist. I married a Baptist pastor. And moved to North Carolina, where I worked on my Ph.D. And my Baptist pastor went to a Baptist seminary. So we are deeply ingrained in the Baptist tradition, as well as have been in ministry. For as long as I've been in academia, I've also been married to a pastor.
Wow. So you have all of the credentials that come along, and then probably all the battle scars too that come along with all of that.
I do. Yeah, I am deeply enmeshed. I think that's one of the reasons I've gotten so much negative pushback, because I'm an insider, and they keep trying to cast me and throw me out and say that I'm actually not. In the evangelical world. And I'm like, y'all, you just picked on the wrong person. I just am. Yeah. This is just who I am. And so you can't really kick me out of it. So
yeah, I watched a really interesting debate you did, and I have forgotten. It was I want to say a British host.
Yeah, it was with Rachel Green Miller.
Rachel Green Miller, right? And so I thought that might be a good jumping off place, because I thought what was interesting about that debate, which was, by the way, if you haven't watched it, it is on YouTube. You should check it out. I love watching people who can debate and who can still be respectful and kind. And I thought you made some amazing points in that dialogue with her. But I thought it would be a good jumping off point to maybe just make some broad definitions of terms, because I felt like she tried to paint herself as a kinder, gentler complementarian. And she was, I will say, she ruffled my feathers less so than some who I've heard. She seemed less strident than most and willing to concede some points. But from within the framework of what your book is addressing, complementarianism is patriarchy, right? Is it just an evangelical's attempt to soft sell what we all know to be true?
Yeah, it's just same song, different verse of patriarchy. Yeah. Patriarchy is it's a historical reality that has been with us from the beginning of civilization. Christians don't like it. We don't like to talk about systemic issues that oppress people. But the reality is that this is not a debatable point in history. There are systemic structures that oppress people. And so patriarchy is one of them. And patriarchy is simply the system. You can't really talk about the patriarchy because there's not just one patriarchy. It shape shifts. That's one of the things I emphasize in my book. It changes over time. But essentially, it is a system in which women are always under the authority of men. And so it's legally, economically, religiously, culturally, whatever. And so complementarianism is just the most recent Christian version of patriarchy, in which they have argued that women should not only be under the authority of men, but that it is divinely ordained. And that for women to usurp that role is sinful, and that it leads to a corruption of God's design for the family.
So would you say, because it strikes me actually that I guess I find that particular brand of patriarchy even more insidious because of its attempt to be soft and attempt to be, right? Does it make sense to you? I'm like at least the patriarchal people are like blunt and honest about the fact that this is what I believe, but I feel like they're trying to sneak one past and trying to say, well, listen, we're sort of egalitarian. We believe in the equality of women, certainly in their position before God. They're of equal worth and value, but God made them differently, and we're supposed to have these, and there can be a place where that sounds borderline reasonable to somebody who's been raised to go, okay, well, yeah, obviously there's a difference between men and women, so we can see that maybe there's a role to play where we quote unquote complement one another. But man, it feels to me like it's just a sneaky way to say, no, women, you're subservient to men, period. Not just your husbands, but to men in general. Is that a fair assessment?
No, it is. Although I will have to say that not everyone who supports complementarianism are really intend to be insidious about it. As I said, I think some are. I think the people who are in charge and have, there are some that that I don't feel much charity towards.
Right.
However, most women and men in most evangelical churches, they simply believe that this is what the Bible teaches, and that if they go against it, they are eroding their faith.
Yeah.
And so I have a lot of sympathy for that. I understand that. And in some ways, the reality is that in most households that espouse complementarianism, it really doesn't matter all that much. Most husbands and wives, even if they claim to adhere to male headship, reasonable people don't really work that way. They talk things out. They make decisions together. I mean, sometimes you compromise. So in many households, it doesn't make much practical. But the problem is that even giving that lip service to it and espousing it, it makes it really hard for the people who are in those dangerous relationships to be able to get out. it also hampers women's leadership in the church. It hampers what God has called women to do. And that's where I think the most dangerous, it's most dangerous in households where women have no escape route. Really complementarianism gives women no escape route. It is also most dangerous to the church because it allows for these types of abusive situations to flourish. And it also denies women their spiritual calling by God, which means that the church is not using its full resources, and that it is putting people who are really not qualified or called into positions because of their sex rather than by what God has called them to do. So it distorts God's purpose for the church.
No, that all of that resonates with me. That story you told of the man who I guess applied to be the church secretary.
Yes.
Really painted in stark colors. Like, okay, this is the issue. You say this and you say this, but the reality is you felt that job was beneath him. Like, why would he want to do this? And then, So you've exposed for all the world to see what you really think about the role of women in your church, that the jobs that they take, they would be beneath a man. I wouldn't even allow him to take that. And I certainly wouldn't elevate a woman to a position of leadership because for whatever reason, poor interpretation of Paul, terrible understanding of history, says, I want to let John jump in because I know he's itching to ask a question, but I just keep rolling on that.
He's waiting patiently there.
He is.
As you're talking, a couple of things kind of come to mind. And the first one was, it's this insidious nature of this underlying, I don't even know what to call it, but it's the same as, the whole hate the sinner or hate the sin, love the sinner, right? It falls under that same, and it allows us to create this dichotomy where we have the othering and
we're better. Where somebody is better than the other person.
Right.
It creates a hierarchy. Yeah,
exactly.
One of the other things that really struck me, and it's because it's a little different than the way Nat and I were raised. So it kind of shocked me a little bit was that you talk about not being able to teach teenage boys. Nat and I were in a couple different churches where women were only relegated to Sunday school. That's the only thing they were allowed to do, which I always thought, as I got older, well, that's kind of ridiculous. So you're telling women they can't preach, they can't stand up in a pulpit and mold the minds of the congregation, but you're going to give them carte blanche access to the kids. And they're going to be able to kind of mold the minds of the young people and kind of maybe steer them in a direction So I found that very interesting. So is that, I guess my question would be, is that a Southern Baptist thing? Is that an SBC thing? Or is that was that specifically to your church?
If you look historically, this is actually a relatively recent phenomenon in complementarianism. If you think about even Southern culture in churches in the 19th and in the first part of the 20th century, women did teach. And almost, women taught everywhere in the churches, except for maybe standing behind the pulpit. But this changed when we move into the 80s, especially when the conservative resurgence took off. And the conservative resurgence was in 1977, and it was the conservative takeover of the Southern Baptist denomination. And what they did is they intentionally took over the seminaries, in order to, and removed women from preaching in those seminaries. They also eventually rewrote the Baptist Faith and Message, where they said that any church that ordained women, essentially that allowed women to be in positions of authority over men, that they were outside of fellowship with the Southern Baptist denomination. So it completely transformed much of the Southern Baptist denomination. But so this complementarianism is not only same song, different verse, but it actually is a harder version of patriarchy in the church than we've seen in a really long time. And so while there are some churches that are still much more culturally like in that mid-20th century model where women pretty much do everything but preach, there are many churches that the lines on what women can do have grown harder and harder and harder. And sort of a manifestation of this is with Wayne Grudem, who was the architect, along with John Piper, of Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, which was published in the early 90s. And Wayne Grudem published a list of what can women do in the church. And it's like 86 different things that he walks through to talk about whether or not women have the authority to be able to do this. Does this hurt the God's given authority over men if women do these roles? And one of the things it says is that, that women a church may decide that a woman can teach Sunday school. But it also is reasonable that a church can decide that is not that puts women in positions of authority over men that really they shouldn't. And so it is also something that churches can, should, it's completely biblical for churches to choose not to do that. And so many churches who are more of that sort of hardline complementarianism, they do enforce that, where women are not allowed to teach they usually either draw the line at the college level or they draw at high school. And so women aren't allowed to teach, high school boys or college age. And I would argue that, they're still mostly boys, until 25,
for sure.
Whereas 40. girls become, our adult brains turn on a bit earlier.
Yeah, for sure. Well, does that not sort of belie their whole assertion too, that because there was that thing you spoke about or in one of the early chapters that they try to paint themselves as, well, okay, we're talking about submission of women inside of a marriage relationship, not necessarily, women subservient to men in general, right? And then they do this crap. And then you say, no, that's actually not true. This exposes the fact that you're not being honest with the fact that you actually do think women are subordinate to all men, even to teenage boys, apparently, which just strange credulity. I mean, I don't understand any of that, but I appreciate so much. And this is where I feel like, I know that we talked about Kristen Dumais and her amazing book and how you guys kind of sort of simultaneously were working on projects that were similar. But I feel like you come at this from very different tacks.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
And it seemed very much like Kristen's book focuses on more recent history, going back to the moral majority and going back to, that. And you go all the way back to friggin' Gilgamesh.
I do.
So let's talk about that, because I think if you could get some of these guys, and I'm under no delusion that they'll ever make this admission, but if you can tie some of this complementarian crap to paganism, which you do very, very well, by the way, I don't know. I don't want to take the words. Tell our people what you did there, because I think it's brilliant.
Well, so this really was one of my first real epiphanies about Christian patriarchy, about complementarianism. And at the time that I had it, I was still within complementarian circles. I would still argue, or at least, give lip service to the fact of male headship. Because I grew up that way. My church was that way. My husband was at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, which is where Paige Patterson was. And so, even though we had really very much an egalitarian marriage, the way that it functioned, we both would still subscribe to male headship. And so when I was in one of my graduate seminars at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I had, this was my women's history seminar, and we were having a conversation about how similar patriarchy looked across time and across global cultures. And I remember it just really hit home to me that day. I mean, I still remember sitting there in that seminar. I can still see the face of the woman sitting across from me. I don't remember her name, but I can still see her face when I sort of had this epiphany. And I was sitting there and I was thinking, if Christians are called to be different, why does the way we treat women look just like the rest of the world? That was really the question. I was just like, why is the rules that we put on women, the claims that we make that it is, because of their bodies, because, whatever claims we make about it, it leads to the same thing, that women are not allowed to be in leadership positions because there's something wrong with us. There is something about us that makes us unable to have those types of leadership positions. And this is the same argument that they made in the ancient world. This is the same argument Aristotle made. This is the same thing we see in Mesopotamian culture. And this is the same thing we see in 21st century evangelicalism.
Wow.
So that continuity just really was, in some ways, maybe the beginning of me unpacking the historical roots of complementarianism.
Yeah. And I love that you went that far back, and you read the book, by the way, folks. We don't want to read it to you, but
Right.
you just need to buy it. It's amazing. But the Epic of Gilgamesh has always fascinated me anyway. And the way that many scholars believe that the Old Testament, as we conceive of it, was likely written, post Babylonian exile. And so these kinds of mythologies would have been familiar to the Jewish authors of the Pentateuch. And, so there's so many parallels between these stories. And I like the idea that it was written more as a polemic against what they had been forced to ingest for however long they were in captivity. And that they write these stories that, that are like, okay, yeah, you have your creation myths, but ours is better. Check it. It goes like this.
Well, it is. It's one of those things that when I talk about with my students, we read the creation story, the Mesopotamian creation story, and then you compare it with the Hebrew creation story. And I mean, the Mesopotamian creation story is the gods decide to destroy the world because humanity annoys them.
Yeah.
And that's the whole, it's a completely different type of God. And then you think about, in the Christian creation story and how, the chances that are given over and over again to try to save humanity. And I mean, it's a stark difference, but yet it's the same world. And so, that's the thing. And so it's like, what did we inherit from that world? Did we inherit the difference in the Christian God, originally the Old Testament God, or did we inherit the leftovers of that pagan world, which always oppressed women?
Well, it's interesting to me that this kind of historical deep dive into the origins of patriarchy would also then dovetail nicely with any sort of anthropology that would say, okay, what is the origin of myth? What is the origin of this? And one of my favorite people on the planet was René Girard.
Oh, yeah.
And what I see in Girard mirrors somewhat, I hope I'm not making too big a leap, of what I see in you, which is one of the things that drew him to any sort of theological work was his recognition of a pattern within all great literature. This is where he derives his mimetic theory, is where he goes, listen, every great story ever told revolves around these same things. There is rivalry. There is, some sort of conflict that results in violence. There's a need for an escape valve, something like a scapegoat mechanism that would come in and allow societies to continue to function if they can blame somebody for all their troubles and then they move on. And so he sees that same pattern emerge over and over and over. And what he sees in the Christian scriptures, or in the Jewish and Christian scriptures, is he sees that pattern broken, where he sees the voice of the victim actually being articulated way more often than where it happens anywhere else. And so, the mirroring that I see is you looking at something like patriarchy and recognizing that it's not a Christian phenomenon. That if anything, the fact that we're still embracing this thing shows us how far we have to go to actually embrace the gospel and say, no, we need to break these patterns that are age old, that have been with us since the dawn of civilization, right?
Yeah, no. And, the thing too is, as you said, the reason that all of our stories sound alike, and, students, I often have students who come from, more conservative Christian backgrounds, and they always get worried when you start talking about the word myth. And I'm like, myth has a historical context. And what we're talking about here, this is not just simply talking about things that, this is this genre of storytelling that tells us about who we are and who we believe we are. And one of the reasons there's so many parallels among these stories is because we are all human. I mean, I think it really speaks to how we are all one, and that we all, it should really unite us. And it also shows us how our foibles, our sin is also still all the same. And one of the things that humans have always tried to do is to justify oppression. And, what we always try to do this. And so it is so amazing to me that Christians today don't realize that instead of that, whereas God all, if we just look through, as you said, if we look through the Old and the New Testament, we see these patterns of God putting forward the oppressed, putting forward the victims. I mean, the fact that there are so many women of ill repute in the bloodline of Jesus, I mean, that is phenomenal. And yet we, instead of focusing on that, we choose to focus on what humans have always focused on, and that is justifying our oppression of others.
Wow. No, so true.
I think we are skating around a question, I'm trying to come up with a good way to talk about it. But I mean, one of the first things that has to go away is this, like the idea of the inerrancy of the Bible, right? And this idea that
now you did it.
Now you're going to lose all of the people listening to you. They're just going to be gone.
Now our people like us. They know.
Well, and then, the other thing that keeps coming up, right, is mistranslations or purposeful
mistranslations.
This is right. This is the part that kind of opened up my eyes to the way patriarchy changed or controlled and how we read the Bible, how the Bible was portrayed to us, and how it was taught to the people in power to teach it then to us laymen, right? And I mean, can you talk a little bit about just this? It's just, now that I see it, it's just so blatant, and so blatantly wrong, and how they masculinized, and that's not a word, but I'm going to make it a word.
Well, androcentric,
the Bible,
made it androcentric,
and in doing, changing names. Right. That's like one of the most, but I mean, it's like we are just going to sit back and just ignore the way Jesus talked about women, the way he brought women around him, and the way, and then we use 2 or 3 verses from Paul.
Yeah. Just a handful of verses.
There are actually more verses where Paul talks about women in teaching roles and in ministry roles and in deacon roles. And we just, can you just talk about how where was the, I don't know how to ask the question. Where was the change?
Right. No, that's great. I can do that. Yeah. So first of all, we'll tackle the word inerrancy. And I've gotten pretty beat up over this term. And what I've tried to tell people, and it's funny because I feel like I'm kind of like talking like this.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I think the way you're using inerrancy, you think that inerrancy is about the Bible, about believing the Bible. That's what we, so if somebody is not, if we say they're not an inerrantist, what we say is they don't believe the Bible. They don't believe in scriptural authority. They don't believe, that's what they're saying. And I'm like, that's not actually what that word is about. That's not actually, inerrancy is a word that was created in the late 19th and the early 20th century, and really begun to be used in the early 20th century. And what it argues is not, do you believe the Bible? It says, you have to believe the Bible this way for you to truly be Christian. It narrows how you can understand the Bible, and it puts gatekeepers over what the Bible actually says. And all of the things that it puts gatekeepers on, mostly don't have to do with salvation, although they would argue it would, because some of the origin of inerrancy was over the word virgin birth, was over that phrase virgin birth. And so that was changed in the RSV because in the text, the word is actually really maiden, young girl. And it certainly does imply an unmarried girl, which in that culture would also imply what we would consider to be a virgin. But when it was changed, which is a more accurate reflection of the text to reflect, young girl, maiden, people got up in arms over it and said that they were now denying the virginity of Mary and thereby questioning the nature of Christ. Which that wasn't it at all. And so this is where the inerrancy kind of comes out of this controversy over, saying that we have to believe the Bible literally the way that it is written. The problem with that is that the literal Bible that they were putting forward was their early 20th century English translation understanding of the Bible. and putting it forward and saying, you have to understand it this way. In fact, B.B. Warfield, who was at Princeton Theological Seminary, which were a lot of the people behind this sort of fundamentalist controversy, and it's certainly not all their fault that all this happened, but it's a really good example. But he said, you may not like what Paul says about women, but the Bible says it, and that's that, essentially that. And so it's just like, that's the end of the story. So you have to read it this way, or else you don't believe the Bible. And so when people charge me with not being an inerrantist, what they are actually trying to accuse me of is not believing the Bible, which is simply not true. So that's kind of what inerrancy is. And part of the way that we got to inerrancy was through English Bible translations. In the medieval world, very few people had complete access to biblical text. That doesn't mean they didn't know biblical text. Medieval people actually knew it very, very well. And it was translated, much of it was translated to them in the vernacular, which would be the everyday language, whether they were English or German or whatever. But to have complete intact Bibles that were, that ordinary people had access to all the time, was not as usual before the revolution of print. That's part of it. They were expensive to produce. They were hard to keep. And so, that's just it. It was a cost thing, a lot of it. And so the way that people learned that was from the teachings of the clergy and from the things that they learned in church, which certainly gave some control over the text and what people were taught. After the printing revolution, where we began to have a lot of Bibles translated into the vernacular and people getting access to that text, one of the problems that they begin to have is people begin to interpret it however they wanted. We can kind of see this, we see this flourishing. And this was also a problem. On the one hand, in the medieval world, there is a problem where you don't have as much access to the text. But in the early modern world, there is also a problem where there is so much access and nobody really knows how to read it. And so it leads to all sorts of you just have to go read some of those really early wild Protestant groups and the way that they interpreted the Bible, and the way that they also begin to translate the Bible. And so, for example, one of the first really widespread English translations of the Bible was the Geneva Bible, which was a protest Bible in England. It was created by people who had left England and gone to the continent because they were upset with what was going on in England. You can think about with the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation in England, and then the back and forth with different kings coming. And many in England saw that England was becoming more Catholic than what they liked, and they didn't think it was Protestant enough. So they went off and they wrote their own Bible under King James. They translated their own Bible during the time of King James, called the Geneva Bible. And they started putting in the footnotes, they started putting the way that they wanted people to read the Bible. So, so they translated the text, and then they would say, this means this. And some of the things that they started doing were and I'm talking too long here, so I'll stop. They were very politically charged. Like one of the things that the Geneva Bible went after was the divine right of kings. And so it, yes, you can see. So it essentially said that you don't have to, that it isn't, that Christians are called to obey God first and their conscience first, not the divine right of kings. And so this made King James really mad. And so King James then started his translation of the Bible, the KJV.
The Lord's version.
He declared no notes. He said there's not going to be any explanatory notes because he thought those were really bad. But then again, the translators, all of the people who translated, they were all men. It's actually a pretty good translation for what they had at the time. But the language that they used was a very masculine language. The early modern English world did not see women as citizens. They did not see women as political actors. And so when they translated text, they were not anticipating women as readers. And they translated all those words as men, as male-oriented. And so the English Bible began to write women out of the text. This wasn't really, I don't think it was an evil plan. It was just that they were doing what was in their culture. and their culture was an androcentric language. They begin to write that into the Bible. And what we see, this sort of becomes normative, this androcentric text. And by the time we get to the 19th century, women are legally in Europe and England, especially women are legally like children, according to British law. And so when those English Bible translators, when they were redoing the text and they come to texts that said things like Phoebe, a deacon of Cenchrea, they would be like, well, Phoebe can't be a deacon because women can't be leaders because women are legally the same as children. So Phoebe must be a servant. And they would translate her as a servant. Junia can't be an apostle. Oh, so that must be a man. Junius. We start to see Junia translated as Junius in the 19th century. Not because that's what the text says, but because that was the interpretation.
That was going to be my next question on that. It was, is there like a historical point where you can actually see Phoebe being changed from a deacon to like a helper, right? And then Junia becoming Junius. I mean, is there like a historical moment where you can like say, okay, here it is?
Yeah, I have a book laying around here somewhere written by a guy named J. Eldon Epp, who did this wonderful chart where he went through all of the Greek manuscripts, all of the Greek versions of the Bible, Greek texts, edited texts. And what he found is that before the 19th century, Junia is Junia, and Junia is an apostle. In the 19th century, this shifts, and Junia starts being translated as Junius and or not an apostle. And there is a very clear turning point. It's in the 19th century. It really picks up in the 20th century. And then at the end of the 20th century, people realize that, Junius goes away because they realize that that is an unsustainable translation. Although the ESV still says it translates it Junia, but then it has a footnote that says, or it can be translated Junius.
Wow.
And that's completely false because it can't be translated Junius. But they still have that in the notes.
One more nail in the coffin for the ESV. I'm done with you, ESV. I got a bone to pick with you.
I'm so sorry. All Bible translations are good in the sense that they most of them still get the gospel message across. But the ESV was low on my list.
Yeah, no, I'm with you there. It's interesting to me that, and aren't there even scholars who believe, because I know that the authorship of Hebrews is hotly disputed, and we always, only the hardcore, dyed in the wool, just dig in your heels, never going to admit anything, still think that Paul wrote Hebrews. We all know he didn't write Hebrews. I'm no academic or scholar, but I know that's probably true.
Not in his voice.
Aren't there some who would even contend for a female authorship of Hebrews, like maybe Priscilla?
There's a lot who would, it makes a lot of sense for it to have been Priscilla, or at least Priscilla and Aquila. It's surprising that their voices aren't part of what's going on. Other people have also put for Apollos, which could also make sense.
Sure.
But there is certainly a lot of people who would suggest that Priscilla certainly could have been one of the authors of Hebrew. And one of the reasons, is it's like, it's weird. It doesn't have authorship, but yet it's canonical, and everybody agrees it's canonical. So some people say, well, who's going to get forgotten? Women are more likely to get forgotten. And so, that's been put forward as one of, there's no evidence. You can't argue from nothing, but it is it is a tempting hypothesis.
I don't know. You mentioned somebody in your book who argues from the silence. Wasn't it Piper? I said his name again. Damn it.
Oh, you said it again.
But talking about patriarchy and going all the way back to Genesis, and he argues from the silence that, well, this is still, because you said that there were those complementarians who would admit, maybe grudgingly though, that whatever we have conceived of,
there's no hierarchy before the fall.
Right. There's no hierarchy before the fall. Adam and Eve were created, the order of creation does not necessarily denote, hierarchy. It's just chronology, for God's sakes.
Well, I mean, that's never made sense to me anyway. I mean, I got to throw my 2 cents on that. It's like, so if we go by hierarchy, by order of creation, then doesn't like animals, birds, they are higher up than us?
Yep.
They were made first, baby.
Either it's animals or it's Eve.
Right.
I mean, those are your two options.
Those are your two choices.
Man is not created either first or last.
Right. So somewhere in the middle. Yeah. So now you have an argument that makes no sense whatsoever, unless, of course, now mind you, if we end up in a society where dogs are in charge, I'm down. I mean, I am happy to advocate all authority.
I don't know. My dogs, I'm not sure. I would be concerned.
They can't do a worse job than we've done with it for the last however many thousands of years, man. How many dogs would go to war? I think they'd be like, I'm just going to stay over here and eat some food and lick myself. I'm just too tired to go over there. Oh, man. But now we've derailed again. But
yeah, it's okay. Dogs are a good thing to talk about.
Yeah, I have a question about the title of your book. Because I wondered, and I have to assume that you wrestled with this a little bit, but is there a reason you didn't put the term biblical womanhood in quotes?
Oh, that's a good thing. One thing is it kind of looks ugly, you know, and some of it is. Something else I thought about doing for it too was actually trying to denote that this was a white construct, because biblical womanhood is a white construct.
Oh, absolutely.
It affects people of color and Black women, but it's imposed upon them. But it's really a white Southern context. So that was the other thing that I thought about doing. We did sort of play to that by, the woman that's on it is, she's sort of a updated version of St. Catherine, and she's totally white, totally sort of reflects what biblical womanhood is. But the thing is that people who are complementarian wouldn't put quotes around biblical womanhood.
No, of course not. No.
They, and so and in fact, my original title for the book was The Myth of Biblical Womanhood.
Ooh, yeah.
And so, which, would immediately undercut it with that. And it was suggested to me that actually the making might be a better, because that's really what I was doing with the book, was explaining how we got here.
Yeah.
Making of biblical womanhood. And so, which actually I did. I think that was a much better title. Myth kind of is, it doesn't have any movement, whereas the making of biblical womanhood, shows the movement through it. So, but then I think with, the subtitle kind of took care of biblical womanhood in air quotes, because how the subjugation of women became gospel truth. And so showing that.
I like it. I just thought I'd pick on you a little bit because.
No, that's okay.
When I tell people about the book and they just read the title, they go, ugh. I'm like, no, you want to read this. This is great. This is, imagine the air quotes around, the biblical womanhood part. And, because, most of the people that I roll with are like, no, that's a bunch of hooey.
Subtitle. What's funny is that some women have picked it up thinking it was about biblical womanhood.
Nice.
And they start reading it, and then I get emails from them. And in fact, one woman was in this book club, and she said the only reason she joined the book club was because she thought it was about how to be a biblical woman. And by the time she got to the end of the book, though, she had changed her mind.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, well, that's okay. I didn't expect that, but it's funny.
Well, and I think it actually, the more I thought about it, the more I thought, I think this does actually begin to define what biblical womanhood is. Because I think that term has been hijacked. I'm not sure it can be taken back. Yeah. It's just like evangelical. That might be a word that just needs to be left in the dustbin of history at some point. I'm not sure it's reclaimable.
Right.
But I think if someone was to read your book with an open mind and get to the end of it and go, oh, so being a quote unquote biblical woman looks an awful lot like being a quote unquote biblical human being with equal access, equal opportunities, equal standing, equal worth, that, okay, yeah, that's a definition of biblical womanhood I can get behind. And then people like the aforementioned puppy kicker have to wrestle with Paul's words about in the kingdom that we're supposed to be having ushered in and functioning in as though it's here right now. Mm-hmm. There is therefore now no slave or free, Jew or Gentile, male or female. How do we then twist even that text of Paul's to continue to draw these hard lines of division between men and women? I don't get it.
It's amazing to me, and when you read many of these complementarians, it's so funny because they are like, oh, well, you have to twist that scripture to make it sound like it means that all people are human. And I'm like, I don't know how you twist that scripture. I'm like, you have to do a lot more gymnastics to twist the verses you use to say that they're applicable to all women throughout time, saying that they cannot teach or lead men. And I'm like, that is a much bigger jump than saying that, in the kingdom of God, that there is neither male nor female, slave or free, Jew or Greek, especially when that is all of Paul's teachings.
Yeah.
And if you talk about harmony in the Pauline text, that's what Paul's about. Paul is about us working together for the good of the gospel and moving beyond these things that divide us.
Yeah. And Paul's always really good at emphasizing these points, isn't he? Like when he says, think about the verse that says, I'm convinced that neither life nor death, nor this, nor that, nor this. Yes. And he goes through his litany of opposites. None of, am I making my point yet? Have you understood what I'm saying yet? And he does the same thing with this text where he's saying, listen, slave, free, Greek, Gentile, Jew, Gentile, male, female. He could have kept going down the list of just, asserting to the nth degree that these divisions are meaningless. Right. And they have no place within the operational kingdom of God. And yet 2,000 years later, we're looking at this backwards and saying, no, Paul's a misogynist. Because I've gotten a lot of a really useful traction out of reading Douglas Campbell's works about Paul. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him and his apocalyptic reading of justification in Paul.
It sounds vaguely familiar, but I'm not sure.
He's a Duke divinity scholar, really, really, really brilliant man from New Zealand who now lives in North Carolina. But he's written several books, and his way of approaching Paul is to treat his epistles as Socratic arguments, and in that structure, oftentimes words that have been attributed to Paul might not even be Paul's words.
Right. That's
where
exactly
he's literally
right.
setting up the false teacher he's talking about. He's setting up their arguments, and then he's dismantling them later on, which is why sometimes he would contend that in Romans, in particular, Romans 1 and 2, where Paul seems to be borderline schizophrenic, where he says this, and then he goes, and then it's all grace, 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 grace. Except if you read it as this kind of argument or this kind of rhetoric that says, no, here's what he's saying. By no means, now we go down this road. So
yeah, Romans 1 has allusions. I don't remember. I taught this in Sunday school not too long ago, but it's actually from a Jewish text.
Yeah.
It's almost, parts of it are almost word for word from a Jewish text where it's saying, you believe this, but now this is, it is. It's very, and Paul, Paul always uses other people's words to set up, and then he does exactly what Jesus does. Jesus says, you were taught this, but now this.
Right.
And that's what Paul does. And I don't understand how we miss it so much.
The only explanation I can come up with is that we want to.
Yeah.
Because our missing it reinforces our biases, because our missing it protects our positions and our finances in some instances, and our sense. I just feel like there's so many people who are in power who are so insecure of losing that power that they'll do anything to protect it, and even if it means the subjugation of an entire, gender or race or whatever. But I also found it really interesting that you mentioned, when you do talk about how this is basically a white construct that's been imposed on people of color, but there are still pastors of color who are still. They're still trafficking in this. And so you make the point that, it's mystifying that these same folks who can read the scriptures and find liberation theology there for a race of people have not yet found a way to extend that to other subjugated people groups. So, what can you say about that? What do you find there?
So there have been a lot of people. I really actually wanted to do more with race in this book. But
Sequel.
Well, I'm not sure if I'm the scholar to do it. I really am a medieval historian. And even though, but there is, that was actually my editor very gently said, Beth, this is a different book.
Yeah.
She said, this is what you're doing. So I put in as much as I could, mostly just alluding to the continuity of this oppressive structure. That, it's the same, saying that women are divinely ordained to be under the authority of men sounds very much like separate but equal.
Yeah, for sure.
And
right,
I mean, that's really, so we're using these same things. And as a women's historian, I know that patriarchy and racism are right there together. They always have been throughout history. So what, from what I have read and what I have talked to people of color and to Black scholars, and one of the things that they argue is that this patriarchy, this particular evangelical form of patriarchy within the church that excludes women from leadership positions and emphasizes male headship in the home, that this actually has been imported from Black churches trying to be accepted by white churches.
Okay.
And so this has been imported into it. And it doesn't really fit real well on the Black church structure because, women historically in Black churches have had a lot of authority and power.
For sure.
And often the wife of the pastor has just as much publicity and significance as the pastor. And so, I mean, this is interesting because it is not a good fit. And there's this really beautiful article that was published on The Witness about a year ago. It came out right around the time my book came out. And it was by a Black Christian man who talks about how when he converted to Reformed evangelical Christianity and he tried to implement evangelical, patriarchy within his home, that it caused significant marital issues for him and his wife because it was so clearly this artificial construct that was being pushed upon them. And finally, his wife said no. And
Right.
It actually changed. I mean, it's this really personal story that he tells. But that's it. It's imposed upon Black churches.
Well, isn't that the way it just seems par for the course for white evangelical church. The white evangelical middle-aged man does this to women, does this to people of color, does this to the indigenous culture, does this to the LGBTQ plus community. I mean, we just, and I say we because I am one of them.
Yeah.
There's no way I can ignore who I am. And we as a group, as a people, whatever you want to call us, continually do this to group after group after group. And, it's, I know it's like it seems like to be my soapbox that I get on quite a bit because it starts to anger me and my blood starts to rise. And I get, and it's not anything, for a very long time, I just ignored this. Right. And I just said, it's not really my fight. It's not really, what the world I want to get into. But as Nat and I are talking to more and more people, we just see this over and over again that we, the middle-aged, heterosexual, white men.
Don't forget balding.
Yeah, well, I am too. You just can't see it. But we have to be a voice to say enough's enough.
Yeah.
And to say, hey, listen to these women. Listen to these people of color. Listen to these indigenous cultures. Listen to the people of the LGBTQ plus community. Listen. Shut your mouth and listen.
Yeah.
So, I will put in a little bit, and this is one of the things that I try to emphasize in my women's history class too, is that patriarchy isn't saying it's all men's fault.
Right.
It's saying that there is a structural problem that elevates male power that is supported by women too.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, is that patriarchy only works because women support it. And so this, there's more to it than just it's like, what is it about us and the human condition that we like to be elevated above other people? And that is something, and, we talk about it in women's history as the patriarchal bargain, that women benefit from this system. And women don't always, some women are trapped in this system and some women are complicit in this system. And so, and some men too, some men are trapped in patriarchy, even though, they might benefit from it, but not all men benefit from patriarchy. It's only some men that benefit from patriarchy, and some women benefit from it too.
Yeah.
So when we think about the structures, we have to think about, how did we get here where we privileged certain people to be above other people, and where we even begin to question the humanity of those who are suppressed. So I think you are right in the sense that we have to listen. And that's one of the things I emphasize is that listening doesn't mean you have to agree with everything, that everybody else presents to you, but it does mean that you listen to them and you learn from them.
Right.
And you treat everyone as made in the image of God. And that would allow us to be able to have civil discourse over,
what's that?
things.
Yeah, I feel like we've forgotten what that even means, civil discourse.
Well, the reason it doesn't work because we think we are right and we refuse to listen to others.
Yeah, and we're so entrenched in our rightness, that we're not even willing to admit we might be wrong.
Right.
It's maddening at times. I pastor a small church in a very small. I guess I say very small. It's not very small, but San Angelo's 100,000 people or so, right? We always call ourselves West Texas. We're more Central Texas. I'm not sure where we get the West part, but we all say it anyway. So you're in Waco. I'm in San Angelo. We're not too terribly far apart, but you understand life in small town Texas. And so but what's really interesting is that in most of the small Texas towns I've been in and spent time in, the Methodist Church figures prominently. We have, in my town of 100,000 people, there are no less than 5 Methodist churches, big ones too, right? And the Methodist Church is pretty egalitarian. I mean, there are women pastors all over the place. Now, mind you, I still think they treat their women pastors like crap. I think they tend to farm them out to little tiny communities. I have several really good friends who are Methodist pastors, women, and they are the ones pastoring the little churches and sometimes pastoring 2 or 3 churches.
Yeah.
And not even fully ordained. They are, they don't get paid as much as the men. They don't get the big pulpits like you know what I'm saying? And that's not true across the board, but it is anecdotally, in my experience, that has been the case. But so as I pastor my little church here in San Angelo, and I ask people about this subject, I'm like, how is it that, there are entire denominations of Christian churches who have gotten this, at least to a point, they haven't perfected, but they've gotten it to the point where they will ordain women. It's not just the Methodist, but, as far as I know, Presbyterian and Episcopalian, and, there are lots of
Baptists.
And I was going to tell you, I have one friend. I'll tell you about my one friend named Penny. She is the only ordained Southern Baptist pastor that I have ever met in my life. Now, they won't give her a pulpit. They won't put her in a church, but they did. I think they might have ordained her just to shut her up, When
was she ordained? Was she ordained recently?
She was ordained, I'm going to say 4 or 5 years ago. Really? Yeah.
Oh, that's really...
Yeah.
I might want to talk to her.
I'll put you in touch with her if you want to. She managed to push her ordination so that she could do prison ministry for women. And the only way she could get into the prisons for women was to be an ordained chaplain. And so she was able to push the issue with ordination by saying, listen, I only want this for this. I want to go into these prisons and have access to these women, but I can't do it. And so they ordained her, but she'll never darken the pulpit of a Baptist church, but she has this little badge of honor, though, that she does have an ordination from the Southern Baptist Convention as an ordained pastor. But she had to hoodwink her way into it. I'll shoot you her email, because she's retired and lives in New Mexico now, and she's just one of my favorite people in the world. Anyway,
that's great.
We used to do work together as clergy, and anyway. But the Methodist Church has a retreat kind of thing that they run called the Walk to Emmaus. And one of the rules of a Walk to Emmaus is we have 5 clergy that work on the team. There always had to be at least one woman. And there always had to be at least one non-Methodist. So that ours was very ecumenical, and there were times I worked walks with, 3 of the 5 clergy were women. And I've learned, I can't imagine not having sat at these women's feet and learned from what they know. They were brilliant, wise, awesome women. And I think you're 100% right when one of the earlier comments that you made was that this is a detriment to the church, because we're cutting ourselves off from brilliance, from revolutionary ideas, simply because of someone's gender, which is just utter foolishness.
Well, it's like you mentioned, and Nat and I talk about this a lot, that he still calls himself a Christian, and I don't. It's not a word I use, but I'm gonna talk about something that you said. It's like, by allowing men to take over roles that maybe they aren't, I'm going to put it in air quotes because I'm not sure I believe it or not, but that they are called for or called to, where we are ignoring women who are called to certain teachings, or we're not allowing them to come into their own talent or gifts because, without sounding crude, because of the way they're built.
Yeah.
So crude, John.
Anatomy. I thought you were going to say something.
I know what you wanted to say.
I was going to say it differently, but I decided to go a little bit nicer. But it just seems disingenuous. It seems hurtful. It seems, there's a whole bunch of adjectives we could put on that.
Unnecessary.
Unnecessary is a good one. Yes.
It's and I think the hardest thing about it is that we have convinced people it's part of the gospel. And that's really what I was striking at in my book, is that this is not, that we have made this a gospel issue. And that, and that's why people won't leave it, because they believe it is part of the gospel.
That's right. It's the same reason they won't leave other toxic beliefs behind though as well. And so John and I I've been going through whatever you want. I mean, the term du jour is deconstruction. And I have been deconstructing my faith for the better part of a decade now. And it seems like we've painted ourselves into a corner with some of these doctrines. And as we sort of expose them for the BS that they are, man, sometimes it's a hard pill to swallow, because we've equated, say the doctrine of eternal conscious torment. We've just said, well, that's the gospel. No, it's not. It's tangential at best. So you can leave that behind and still believe, so it's been a process though of unraveling, I guess, unentwining. I don't even know what's the word.
This is where history can help us.
Yeah.
And one of the problems with evangelicals, and even in really ways with modern American Christianity, is we have a very short view of history. We start our history with, it may be the Reformation, but really with the founding of the U.S. and, thinking about the groups that come over here. And so, we're mostly interested in groups from Europe that have an American presence in the early, in the 17th century, et cetera. And so by doing that, we have a very small understanding of how Christianity has been, of Christian beliefs that have been very strong Orthodox Christian beliefs throughout history, or, have changed over time, because we have such a short view of history. And that's really one of the things I was trying to do. In fact, I've written a lot about this, and I think I can say safely, without giving away too much, that my next book will be about this. Is thinking about the importance of the long view for Christians and how that enriches our faith, and how dangerous it is to be so short-sighted.
Yeah. Well, and short-sighted both in both directions, right? Like not knowing our history. Yeah. One of the things that shocked me about myself was how historically ignorant I was. And raised in evangelical churches my whole life, we weren't introduced to anything that approached historic Christianity.
Yes.
As far as we were concerned, it all started in 1970 with the Jesus movement, or
because
whatever.
It's Catholic.
Yeah. And so it really was a walk to Emmaus that I've brought up twice now. So Methodist Church, you owe me a little bit. But no, it was that exposure.
I'm sure they'd be happy.
I'm sure they would be. Yeah. But a very ecumenical weekend spent with all kinds of people. And it exposed in me how much entrenched bias there was for me against anything that was not non-denominational evangelical Christian. And then, I start reading a book here and a book there, and these, people start bringing up people like, I don't know, Athanasius or Irenaeus, or you start talking about the early church, you start talking about the Desert Fathers, and I realize I know nothing about any of this.
The
Desert Mothers.
Yes.
Avila, you go to the medieval, I think again, and again, I don't mean to harp on this. I think it's intentional. I don't want to let them off the hook by saying, well, they didn't mean to. No, I think it was intentional. The lack of education that we got, the lack of exposure to anything.
19th century.
Yeah. I mean, it was just absolutely nuts to me. So I devoured In fact, I still have volumes of books on my shelves that I need to read from to better acquaint myself with what historic Christianity looks like, and how to recognize in how many different and sundry ways it's been twisted and distorted to serve a wholly other agenda. Well,
and to show how easily we can fall back into that mindset of the American version of Christianity, right? In talking with another guest, Felicia Merle, I had mentioned something. I don't even know how we got on the topic of missionaries going to Africa. And her comment was, "You realize that Africa knew Jesus before you guys knew Jesus."
Yes, that's exactly right.
Yeah. And it was like one of those watershed moments where I was like,
of course,
I have never thought of it that way, and how could I not? And you go back and you look at you reread stuff in the Bible, you read some historical stuff, and you realize that. Yeah, I mean, how ignorant and just oversighted we are, thinking that we are going someplace to explain something to them as if they had never heard it.
Yep. No, you're exactly right. And I mean, and a lot of it is intentional. It also is just simply, I think what makes me sad about I've talked with a lot of the ex-evangelical movement and had really great conversations with them. And one of the things that makes me sad is that as a historian, I think if we had a deeper understanding of Christianity, our faith would be deeper, which means that even when we deconstructed modern American Christianity, it wouldn't deconstruct our faith. Yeah. Because we would realize that we were still standing with people who had believed the core of what we believed for thousands of years. Yeah. And that God hasn't changed. It's just that our understanding of him has changed. And so when we're deconstructing the things we've added to God. And that if we look through history, we see how consistent God has been. So, I think if we had a deeper understanding of history, we would have our faith would not be in so much peril. It makes me sad because we're just missing so much because we have such a narrow and short view of history.
So maybe what we do is that as we realize, some other areas in the church that are lacking, right? Like in taking care of mental illness, right? Where we are saying the church church is not prepared to deal with mental illness. And hey, why don't we bring in an actual psychologist or someone or a therapist, not a pastor who says, "Hey, I do therapy on the side," right? So maybe what's needed is for a pastor or the deacons or the elders or whatever to say, "Hey, maybe what we need to bring in is an actual historian."
Or maybe actual theologians.
I keep advocating for that. I'm like, seminaries, I'm like, y'all hire historians.
Yes.
Right.
Don't hire back pastors who had a major in history.
Yeah, no.
But have done nothing else. I'm like, hire a historian. I mean, I'm all over that.
Well, we've realized, I think, some of us anyway have realized the difference between, actual historians and people who pretend to be them and how they can, write.
Not to be elitist about it, but there is methodological training.
No, I don't sense that as elitism at all. It's the same thing that one of my issues with the modern church, especially the American evangelical church, is their anti-intellectualism to the point where it's almost a badge of honor to have not gone to seminary. I haven't been indoctrinated by those liberal whatevers. I just read the Bible. Well, the fact is there's methodology that you're missing. There are hermeneutical tools you don't even know how to access. There's exegesis you don't know how to do. And you are literally just clubbing people over the head with the most sometimes rudimentary instrument you can think of. And you have decided in your arrogance that whatever revelation you think you have is the gospel. And it breaks my heart. And I know people who've gone the other way with this, and I know people who are very snobbish and elitist, about that as well. And I'm not making the claim that unless you've gone to seminary, you can't be a preacher or a pastor. Of course not. But every good and honest preacher / pastor that I know is continually educating themselves.
Right. It's that posture.
They're doing the very best they can to say, hey, I'm still a student here. I'm still learning, and I am open to being wrong about any of this.
Right. It's a posture of learning.
Yeah. exactly. And so for people like you who come along and remind us of that, man, I'm really, really appreciative of that there are resources like your book and like Kristen's book and that are giving voice to and honestly, I'm pleased as hell that the attention that you're getting, that the book is making some waves. Phrase. Yes, pleased as hell. I'm just pleased as punch that. Well, I don't know that it would have been too darn long ago when a book like yours or a book like Kristen's or Felicia's or whatever might have found its way into some obscurity. And I do love the fact that it's not happening. That
it's crazy.
Right. Yeah.
That your book is being read. It's having an impact. I'm waiting for those stories. I want to hear the stories of people who have read this and said, oh, you know what? I started out here, and by the time I got to the end of the book, you've shifted me a little bit. Yeah. Because I think that makes it all worthwhile. But man,
you're dead right.
Super, super excited for you. And thankful that you made the time to talk to a couple of, bearded white dudes from Texas and California. So
I'm glad. I am thankful. This has been fun.
Yeah, it had. Oh, always a blast.
Yeah, I'm glad y'all are doing this. And you actually did. You caught me at the end. I think I only have 5 podcasts left.
Really?
I just decided to take a break for a while.
No, I totally get it.
And I was like, so anyway, but these last one, the one I did last week and this one too, they've been great because they've also been different. They haven't just been rehabbed. So I'm actually really, I like that they've taken a different turn. So this has been a lot of fun.
Good. I'm glad that we got you at the right time. And again, just super happy for your success and for the success of the book. And I'm eagerly awaiting the sequel or whatever your next tome
won't quite be a sequel.
All right. Well, make sure and buy Beth's book, Dr. Barr. It's worth the read. It's worth the audio. In fact, I've got a hard copy. I'm going to get it, and I have the audio version. Both. I'm doing both. It's remarkable how well written it is, obviously, but how well researched it is, and I just can't say enough good things about it and about you. But you're on social media, I'm sure, Facebook and Instagram. You have a website as well that needs to be updated, but get up.
Yes, I regret it someday.
Well, and you're on Twitter, right? I did see you have a pretty decent sized Twitter following.
I regret Twitter quite a bit.
Do you?
I do. Yeah, it's
understand.
Scary.
It can be a bit of a shit show sometimes, can it? Like a little bit. I had to get one profanity in there, John, so that we could get our explicit rating. So yeah, it is a bit of a minefield sometimes. But
I didn't know we were going for an explicit rating. There you are.
We're always going for one. John hasn't dropped one F-bomb, and I'm so disappointed in you. I know. I can usually count on you to get pissed and say something.
Everything seems so academic. Everything seems so academic. It seemed out of place.
I dropped one F-bomb when Ellen Compton not Ellen Compton. We were interviewing Kristen actually, and she looked shocked. And I went, "Oh, okay, maybe we're not going to go there." I don't think she really was, but she looked like I'm like, okay, it's this kind of show. All right, but make sure, like I said, check out everything by Beth Allison Barr. You will not be disappointed. Make sure and support her and all of her work. And anyway, just thank you for being here. We truly, truly appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank y'all.
Thank you for listening to This Is Not Church. Be sure to rate and review the podcast on your platform of choice. If you would like to partner with us, visit patreon.com/thisisnotchurch, where you will receive exclusive content such as early access to episodes, videos of upcoming episodes, and live Q&A sessions. Be sure to check out our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode.